Hey everybody, this is Kenny. Welcome back to another edition of the Leading from the Middle podcast. This is a podcast for middle managers who want to develop themselves, develop their teams, and improve their results. I got the honor of being joined by podcaster and author and the guy who helps Christian leaders lead in a healthy way, Markus Watson. Join me today. And this is a podcast for all. This is not just for Christian leaders. Wait till you hear Markus's story and journey and his spiritual formation that made him just a great leader. And now he's taking all that and he's sharing it with other leaders across all spectrums. You don't want to miss a second of this. Let's get at it.
This episode is brought to you by Kitcaster. Kitcaster books you on top podcasts. How do funded startup founders attract prospects and talent? Podcast interviews. How do entrepreneurs with exits find new deals? Podcast interviews. How do C-suite execs differentiate in crowded markets? Podcast interviews. Kitcaster books you on top podcasts. Click the link in the show notes for a special offer. Celebrate good conversation.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to the Leading from the Middle podcast. And I tell you, man, I have got a leader here today that is going to inspire you, is going to talk about things from a couple of different perspectives. And I can't wait for you to hear his story and get his advice on leading and about Christian leadership as well. But let's just get to him. Here is a gentleman that's helping Christian leaders lead in a healthy way. He's also a podcaster. His podcast name is Spiritual Life. He's going to talk about the other things that he do as well. I want to introduce Markus Watson to the podcast today. Markus, it is so great to have you on. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Kenny. Thank you.
Oh, man, absolutely. Well, I tell you, you have found, I was fascinated at reading about you and doing research about the work that you do. And what a really nice balance that you found in really helping church leaders, Christian leaders, but also I found your stuff is good for every leader. And so I want to hear about what's led you to this point to want to do what you do. Tell us your backstory.
Sure. So I'm a pastor, and going back, to pre-pastor, that was something I never planned on doing. My dad's a pastor, and I love my dad, but that was his thing. And and eventually, I actually tried to work in Hollywood for a few years. That was kind of my dream. And I discovered that if you're going to make it in Hollywood, that has to be the number one priority in your life. And I just couldn't get there. I couldn't make it the number one thing. And so I explored a few possibilities, tried out seminary, and realized I think this is where God wants me. And so, and actually, it was quite clear when I finally got there, because I just loved it. So ended up going into ministry as a pastor, first as a youth pastor, of course. That's kind of the typical path, and loved doing that. And then as a senior pastor, and was at a church. I live in San Diego. So I was at a church here in San Diego that was great for about 7.5 years. And then after that time, just got really kind of ugly. Someone made some accusations about me, accused me of having a problem with pornography. And of course, full disclosure, right? It's not like I've never seen pornography, but had at that time already been in an accountability relationship and accountability software on all my devices, which is important, I think, for everyone. And so, anyway, so it turned into, how should I say it? Well, it wasn't handled very well. So in our denomination, Presbyterian Church, when a person makes an accusation like that, it goes to the presbytery, and then they're supposed to form an investigative committee. And then, so there's a good, healthy process that protects all the parties. But they didn't do that in my case. They kind of did a secret, under the table investigation, which turned out to be really damaging for me and my family, and for my ministry at the church. Of
course.
And it was terrible, but also incredibly transformative, because I was in this place where I had no idea what the future held, and I didn't know I mean, I didn't know what was going to happen, whether if I was going to lose my job. I had this moment. I'll share this moment with you. I spent a lot of time during those several months of this first investigation. There was another one because this was handled so poorly. But anyway, I had this moment where I was kind of sitting on my patio, and I spent a lot of times in Psalms of Lament, which are these kind of psalms in which, David or the psalmist cries out, "Oh God, where are you?" and saying things like, "Lord, destroy my enemies." And I was like, oh, now I know what that
Yeah.
means, because I've got these enemies that I feel like are trying to ruin me.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I was reflecting on that psalm, and then just kind of spending some time in silence, and I started thinking about all the things that could happen if it looked like these allegations were true. And what I should add is I didn't say this yet, right? So initially the allegation was pornography, and then I was told that I had given them my laptop to do a search on, and I had nothing to hide. But then they said, "Oh, that your laptop has been handed over to the authorities, and it's now a potential criminal investigation." And I was like, "What are you talking about? Like, what is happening?" So I was in this really dark time, and I'm sitting on my patio thinking about, I mean, just thinking, what's going to happen. And I kind of started to spiral into this dark place. And I was thinking, gosh, I could lose my job, which I did eventually. I thought I could lose my ordination, right, as a pastor in our denomination. I could lose my reputation. And to me, that was almost like the worst, that all of my church members and fellow pastors in our presbytery would think, "Oh, Markus did that terrible thing," whatever it was. And then I thought, man, I could lose my family if it looks like I'm guilty. Because I was thinking, if it's potential criminal, I'm thinking, oh, child pornography. But I've never looked at child pornography. I've never had that. But I'm like, did somebody put something there, right? Our tech guy was not a friend at the moment, and so maybe that's not what happened. But that's where my mind went, right? So I'm scared, and I don't think my family would have left me, but that's where my mind was spiraling into, right? And then I was like, I mean, am I gonna become a registered sex offender? And everywhere I go, I'm gonna have to declare this thing that isn't even true, but people are gonna believe this about me. And I was like, am I gonna go to prison? And so I had this image of myself sitting in a prison cell, just all by myself, having lost everything. And I was like, this might be my future. And then in that moment, it was like, like I sensed God saying to me, I didn't hear him, but I sensed him saying, "Yes, Markus, they might take everything from you, but they can never take my love from you." Right. And in that moment, I was like, oh, right. Oh, this is the one thing, the most important thing, right, is the love of God, and that the fact that I am God's beloved, and no one can strip that away from me. And so so that was, in a way, when I think about my life, I think about my life as before that moment and after that moment. I believed in God's love. I knew God loved me, right? I knew it, but I didn't know it the way I knew it in that moment or even since then, right? And so God's love became so much more real to me after that. I'll summarize the rest of the story. So turns out interestingly, it was the FBI who had my laptop, and they basically said that, yeah, I know, I couldn't believe it. Like, I was like, this is what I'm supposed to read about this in an article in a magazine, right? I'm not supposed to actually experience this, or in a book, But basically they said, there's nothing there. And so they gave me my laptop back, which was great. But then the person who made the allegations, it was a staff person at our church, said, well, since the laptop was handed to the FBI, then there must have been something there. So the first was sort of this under the table investigation. So now this person made formal allegations, so that there would be an official investigation. And so got investigated a second time. But I'm actually kind of glad, because this one was now above board. And after a few more months, it was determined, yeah, there's no evidence to support the allegations. However, it stirred up enough doubt in the congregation that a few months later, there was a congregational vote, and they voted to dissolve their relationship with me. That's the language that we use. And it passed by only a margin of 2 votes, right? So barely, just over half the congregation voted to dissolve the relationship with me. Now, by that point, I was ready to go. It had the whole process lasted about a year. And it was a really, really hard year. But God was good through all of it. I even met with a lawyer at one point, and because I was like, I have no protection, in whatever is happening here, I have no protection. And so my wife and I met with this attorney. Someone had recommended her. I didn't know that she had had experience with child pornography cases. So I told her just kind of everything that was going on. And she kept saying things like, well, if you are guilty, I'm not going to represent you. And she was painting these really sort of dire, bleak pictures of what would happen if I was guilty. Like, they're going to knock the police are going to knock on your door in the, 4 in the morning, get you out of bed and take you to the police station or whatever, all these things. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. After about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, she said, well, I can tell you're not guilty. I was like, you can?
Wow.
Well, how can you tell? She said, you're not asking the right questions. If you were guilty, you'd be asking about, what's our defense going to be? How much time am I looking at? And you're just asking about how to get your laptop back. I was like, oh, thank you. Someone can see what's really going on here. So, right, little moments like that. And really the thing that I came away with from this whole experience was just the fact that the most important thing about me is that I am God's beloved, right? I don't need to prove myself to anyone. I don't need to be like a hugely successful pastor, by society standards. In other words, the biggest and the best church, and all that. My calling now is just to help people know that they're God's beloved, right? That's what I want them to know. And if they don't get their theology perfect, you know what? I don't have my theology perfect, probably, right? God will take care of that. Well, we can have some conversations. I just want people to know that they're God's beloved. And I think when a person really begins to believe that, I mean, that changes everything, right? That changes everything for them. So, yeah. So that's kind of, wow. So I left church ministry for a few years. I was working in a nonprofit, and then slowly made my way, because I was just like, I don't ever want to work in a church again. That's kind of where I had come to. Yeah. But then slowly was able to make my way back into a church with a really loving congregation that restored my hope in the local church and the people in local churches. And now I'm at another church that is also actually just great, and I really love it. And so anyway, yeah.
What a redemption, what a transformation story. I hate it. I'm so sorry you went through that.
Yeah.
But boy, oh boy, it sounds like it really, really changed your life. So now, Markus, where does it come in that now you've got this passion to really help other church leaders and help leaders in general?
Yeah, well, in some ways it comes right out of that, because I was like, now I know what it feels like to be a pastor, a leader who is really struggling. And I'd had, little struggles before that. I mean, leadership is not easy. But I just sort of developed a heart for pastors and for healthy leadership. One of the things that became clear to me is that, I wasn't a bad pastor, but I had a lot of ego. Not that I would say not that I came across as particularly egotistical, but inside, right, in my inner life, I wanted to be thought of as a great pastor, even if it wasn't, oh, what a big church, but oh, look, he's done some really good things with that church, and it's growing, or whatever, or look at that great ministry that they've initiated. And there was that motivation inside of me. I wanted people to think really well of me, but I think that can be really almost destructive to our souls when that's the thing that we are focused on, because we're never gonna measure up, so to speak. We're never gonna quite feel like we're good enough if we're trying to meet other people's approval. right? All the approval we need has been granted already, right, by the God who loves us. And so helping, all right, so helping pastors on the one hand, in their inner life, begin to recognize that, oh, I don't need to prove myself. I'm just called to be who I am. I kind of think of spiritual formation as the process of becoming more fully myself, right? As I grow in my connection and relationship with Jesus, right? Jesus helps me become more fully the me I was created to be. And the more that I can be that person, right, that true Markus, the more freedom I can lead with more freedom. I can serve with more freedom. I don't have to lead with anxiety, you know. So that's sort of the inner life part. But then the outer life part is also recognizing that God's mission is to, the way I think of it is just to restore healing and wholeness in the world. Now, I think of it sort of in four ways. I love the word shalom, which is this Hebrew word that means peace, right? But it's more than just absence of hostility. It's sort of this comprehensive state of well-being, right, that touches every aspect of life. And so when we experience shalom, we experience sort of a confidence and security, right, in ourselves. We experience good relationships with each other. We have all the provision that we need for a good, joyful, healthy life. That's all part of shalom. There is love in the world when there's shalom. There's justice in the world when there's shalom. There's compassion in the world when there's shalom, right? And we experience that. That's a life of shalom. So when I think of, so I kind of feel like that's the mission of God in the world, right? And that sort of became clear for me through this experience too. We are called to experience shalom in our relationship with God. That's what salvation is. Jesus came to restore shalom between us and our Heavenly Father, right? And then we're also called and invited to experience shalom in our relationships with each other, right? That's part of the spiritual growth process. We learn to love one another and even love our enemies, right? We're invited to experience shalom with the created order. In other words, all of creation. In Genesis 2, God tells Adam, take care of this garden that I have for you. And so, right, so there's this, when I love hiking lately. I've kind of gotten into hiking, and I just love the experience of shalom as I'm going through a hike through the hills here. And then shalom in ourselves, within ourselves. So sort of a harmony with our own selves. This is kind of what I mentioned already. But so I think that I want to help pastors and churches sort of think about God's mission in those ways, and how does each church's community, right, the neighborhood in which they are placed, in which they exist, what does that community need, right? And maybe it's primarily one of these four things. Maybe they really need a restored relationship with God. Maybe that's the greatest need for that particular. Or maybe there's a lot of broken relationships, and so maybe there's a ministry that reaches out to people in terms of healthy relationships. Or maybe there's a lot of damage to the world around them, so to speak. And so maybe there's a sort of like a like a creation care kind of a ministry, or maybe it's a counseling kind of ministry for their inner life. So anyway, each church is gifted in unique ways, and so I want to help churches discover how are we gifted, and each community has unique needs. And so where's that overlap, the gifting of the church with the needs of the community? And I just want to help pastors and churches do that. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank God that that's on your heart. It's everything you said is so needed today. And it's all about leadership. But I love how you said spiritual formation first. And that helps you become the person that you were meant to be,
That's right.
fully, and you're comfortable in your own skin and spirit. And then you can go out and lead.
Yeah.
Change. I gotta, and I'm gonna move a little bit to
Yeah.
also getting some advice from you
Mm,
on leaders in the secular world. But
hmm.
first, you help pastors lead through change. I
Hmm.
have to tell you, for churches to change, I find it a lot more difficult than
Yeah.
a business. So, what are
Yep.
some things, hints, and tips that you give leaders in both worlds on
Uh-huh.
helping lead their congregations or their
Yeah.
teams
Yeah.
through
Yeah.
change?
Yeah. So, one of my favorite definitions of leadership comes from Ronald Heifetz, who is a leadership um, uh, expert guru at Harvard, actually. So, and he wrote some great books: "Leadership Without Easy Answers," "Leading on the Line," yeah, Leadership on the Line." And he says that leadership is disappointing your people at a rate that they can absorb. That might be a paraphrase, but something like that, right? Disappointing your people at a rate that they can handle or at a rate that they can absorb. Um, that's because anytime there's change, there's going to be some grief, right? Because it's a loss, right?
Yes.
If you used to do things this way, or this used to be the experience of your church or your team, and now we're going to do it this way, there's some kind of loss, even if it's just a loss of familiarity with maybe a new process. I knew how to do it this way, and now you want us to do it this way. Well, there's a loss that happens, and so there's a disappointment that happens, even with team members or congregation members who really like you. And so how do you lead people through that experience of disappointment into the new thing that you are called to lead them into? I think one of the things that we need to do is we really need to listen, right? Listen to our people, um, and not listen for the sake of coming up with a good response. There may be a good response, but really listening uh, to to hear where they are, right? To hear their heart. Uh, I wrote this book called Beyond Thingification, and the word thingification, I think, actually originally came from Martin Luther King Jr. The place that I came across it was in a book about spiritual formation, and kind of the idea there is we have this tendency in churches, for sure. I know this because I have been guilty of it, but I'm sure in businesses as well, where we thingify people, right? They become objects
Oh,
who
yes.
exist, right? They exist to achieve our purposes, right? So in terms of a church, pastors will sometimes thingify people, and leadership teams even will thingify the people in their church. They exist to show up to church on Sunday. They exist to give their tithe so that we can get our paychecks and pay for the building and pay for other ministries as well, right? They exist to volunteer, to serve, right? So that we think of them as these objects who exist to support the ministry initiatives of the paid staff in some ways, right? That's a kind
Hmm.
of thingification. Um, and I imagine it happens in businesses as well, right? Where we tend to thingify our employees, right? The people, our teams, where they exist to achieve our purposes, right? And we forget sometimes, I think. I mean, everybody's got a story. Everybody's got something that they're wrestling with, that they're struggling with at that time. That doesn't mean we have to be their counselors every day, but just recognize um, something's going on, right? Something's going on in that person's life.
Hmm.
And so, right, so that's the listening part. And I think that, if our teams, um, first of all, right, we earn their respect when they feel heard, right? When they feel
Hmm.
listened to.
No doubt.
Um, yeah. And when they feel like, okay, this person, our manager, our leader, whoever, our pastor, knows where I'm coming from. All right, I'll go a step or two with him or her, right? And then maybe I'll go another few steps. And then you get to the point where it's like, oh, this is not so bad, right? uh, you know, and so it is those little
Yeah.
steps while
Hmm.
listening, truly listening and loving. And I think loving our people as well, right? And I was just I met with our elders yesterday, and we were looking at Romans chapter 12, where Paul says something like, don't just I'm paraphrasing here, but don't just act like you love each other, really love each other, genuinely love each other. And so, right, there's the spiritual formation part where we can pretend to love our people in order to get them to do what we want them to do. But then also,
Yes.
I think there's that invitation to be formed truly into the kind of people who actually love them. And that means maybe sometimes slowing down the process of change leadership, I don't know,
Yeah.
or making adjustments along the way. Anyway, those are some
Yeah.
thoughts. Yeah.
No, those were unbelievable and just so dead on, especially the listening part and the
Mm-hmm.
thinkification. Because we do that sometimes, whether we intentionally do it or not. We'll, all of a sudden it's not people anymore. We're just talking about one big thing.
Yeah.
This has been amazing. I have one more question for
Yeah.
you for now, and then I definitely want folks to know how to connect with
Mm-hmm.
you. And this is going to be a little bit selfish for me, but I know that a lot of my audience struggles with this. So I'm in the middle of spiritual formation. I'm not a pastor,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm a leader out in the secular world,
Mm-hmm.
and I, but there's times where I feel like my faith might be a little compromised,
Yeah.
having to lead or having to really come down hard on someone, whatever the
Mm-hmm.
business is dictating at
Yeah.
that moment. Marcus, what's a
Yeah.
couple of tips that you've given leaders that are out there that are trying to weave their
Yeah.
way to
Yeah.
the secular world and they're struggling with that?
Yeah. So the thing that comes to mind for me is, I'm a big believer in the sacredness of all vocations. Work is good. Work is something that God created. Work is different from toil. When you think about the creation story, right? Uh, God instructed Adam and Eve to work the garden and take care of it, right? That's part of the order of creation. Work is part of the order
Yeah,
of creation. It is what, in part anyway, it is what we were created for. The curses after the sin, right? Then you've got, oh, now there's going to be thorns and thistles, and you have to work by the sweat of your brow, right? That's different. That's
yeah,
toil now, right?
totally.
But work
Yes,
is good. And so I think it's important for um, so thinking about your listeners, I want them to believe that their work is good and their work is sacred, because it is one of the ways in which God restores shalom in the world, right? If you got somebody who owns an air conditioning company, uh, and they install air conditioners in homes and businesses, that's a good thing. I'm really glad that there are air conditioning companies in the world, because it brings some shalom to me and my family on a hot day.
yeah,
That is a gift. It is a gift that God gave someone, I don't know who, the ability to invent air conditioning, right? Thank you, Lord, for that. Right, someone who manages a restaurant, right? That food brings delight to people and joy and nourishes their bodies. And some of it's more healthy than others, but that's okay. There is shalom in that. And if you've got employees, that business is providing provision. It's bringing provision to those employees so that they can take care of their families, right? And they can live a good, healthy, joyful life of shalom. Or even like a garbage collector. Sometimes people will say, come on, but not a garbage collector. Where's the sacredness in that? Yeah, well, you know what? I'm so grateful for our garbage collector, because I've been in parts of the world where you can smell the garbage burning because they got no
yeah,
one to take it anywhere, and
yeah,
it lingers in the air, or right, or places where there's sewage running through the streets, and we look at that and we say that's not what God wants for the world. And so I'm really grateful for plumbers, right,
yes,
who give us systems for disposing of the things that can cause disease in the world, right? That is all sacred. That is all good work, that the world needs, and it brings shalom into the world, right? And so I think it's really important for all of us to recognize that every vocation is sacred. Now, there can also be bad applications of work. You can be a great
Yes.
business person who provides you know safe toys for children, right? And developmentally appropriate choice. Or you can be a business person who sells illegal drugs on the street, right? One of them is a good application of the gift and the vocation of business. The other one is a broken application, a sinful application of that.
Yeah.
So maybe we also keep in mind then, as we're doing our work, okay, am I applying my vocation is sacred, no doubt about that, unless our product or whatever is actually contributing to the brokenness of the world, then we might want to rethink what we're doing. But if it's not, okay, this is God has called me to this, and how can I be the kind of leader who not only brings shalom to our clients and customers, but also brings shalom to my colleagues and coworkers and employees, right? So that we are a team of shalom, and we are restoring healthy relationships with one another. So anyway, and there, we could dig further into how exactly to do that. But I think that I want people to know that I'm not, because I'm a pastor, my job is not more sacred than yours. It's the calling that God has given me, right? But God has given you a calling too, and that is also a sacred vocation.
Oh man, that was leaders. That was priceless
Mhm.
advice. Because if you get to a place and you just break it down, I realized very early on as cell phones grew
Mm.
how important my job was, how phones
Mm.
connect families and keep people
Mm-hmm.
connected,
Yep.
keep people safe. And so once I got to that place that this was a sacred job for me to
Yeah.
have, and then taking care of others and others' lives,
Mm-hmm.
I love how you put that, and
Mm.
that adds such a different perspective on how you can then weave, your way through the
Yeah.
day in and day out other stuff that comes with,
Yeah.
running a restaurant or running a retail
Yeah.
store, because there's going to be other stuff, for
Yeah.
sure.
For sure. For sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh man, this has been just remarkable, Marcus.
Mhm.
Um, I love how you shared your story so openly. It is so
Mm.
inspiring. And it is just everything you said has just been remarkable. So thank you so much for this priceless advice that you've given. But I want to make sure before we go that, because I'm not sure if I said your podcast
Mhm.
right, and I've
Yeah.
listened to it, and
Mhm.
I think I left out part of it.
Okay.
So let everyone know where they can
Yeah.
connect with you, find your podcast, and you're also
Yeah.
an author.
Uh-huh.
So let everyone know where they can get your book, find your podcast,
Yeah.
and connect with you
Great. Yeah. So my podcast is Spiritual Life and Leadership. Spiritual
in
Life and
leadership. Yeah.
Leadership. Yep. And kind of so, and I work with Fuller Seminary's Church Leadership Institute in doing this podcast, and so we talk a lot about adaptive leadership. So kind of like some of the things that we talked about here today. How do you lead people through change? I do the podcast partly in partnership with Todd Bolsinger, who has written a fantastic book called Canoeing the Mountains, which is designed for churches, but it's all about leading people through change. And so anyway, so that's the podcast. You can also find me on my website, markuswatson.com, and that's Markus with a K, Markus,
Right. Yeah.
Watson.com. I just have to clarify because a lot of people do it with a C, and I get that. So
Yes.
anyway, and then my book, Beyond Thingification, Helping Your Church Engage in God's Mission. We talk a little bit about vocation, kind of what we talked about here, and then also I present a process called neighborhood connection groups, which can help people. And really what it teaches is a listening process. And so it's also applicable in some ways to businesses as well. But how do you listen to your neighbors? How do you listen to God? How do you listen to one another in order to discover how God is calling us to serve the people in our neighborhood? So anyway, those are three ways. Yeah.
Oh, that is awesome, man. We'll make sure that's in the notes. We'll make sure that's posted everywhere,
Cool.
in case people are driving and they get a chance to write all
Yeah.
that down. Marcus, thank you so much. I can't wait to connect with you again and learn
Cool.
more from you. And I'll continue to listen, and I got to get your book. So thank you so much for what you're doing. God bless everything you're doing.
Thanks.
It is especially from where you came from, and to now be so selfless and
Mm,
just put everything out there to help others
Yeah.
is amazing, amazing work. So God is going to continue to bless that for sure. And please continue to do it. But thank you so much for joining me and being so generous with your time today.
Thanks, Kenny. And thank you for having me. And thanks for all the good work that you're doing. I love how you're serving leaders in the marketplace. I think it's so important. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Well, we're going to leave it there. Folks, this has been Kenny and Markus. This has been the Leading from the Middle podcast. We will talk to you real soon.